On this day in history, November 9th through 10th, 1938, was Kristallnacht. If you haven't seen my previous video before this, please go look at it. It goes into a more depth version of what Kristallnacht was. In this video, I will be reading from a book called We Remembered the Holocaust by David A. Adler from Chapter 4, There Were Flames Throughout the City. It goes through a brief recap of what I already spoke about in my previous videos, but this one is different because it includes actual accounts from people who were there, and the accounts of what they remember after Kristallnacht. Nazi policy wasn't just to harass Jews, it was to force them out of Germany. On the night of Friday, October 28, 1938, thousands of Polish-born Jews were chased out of Germany into Poland. At certain points along the border, Polish guards would not allow the Jews to enter Poland. Many Jews spent a sleepless night at the border in empty railway freight cars, crowded railroad stations, and open fields. Many waited near the border, hoping that an agreement between Polish and German authorities would allow them to return to their homes in Germany. Among the Jews deported to Poland was the Grinspan family. Berta Grinspan sent a postcard to her 17-year-old brother Herschel, who was studying in Paris. She wrote that a policeman came to their house that night and told them to take their passports and report to the police station. From there, they were taken in a police car to the town hall. They were held there and given orders to leave Germany within 4 days. "We are penniless," she wrote her brother. "Please send some money to us at Lotz. Love to you from us all, Berta." Herschel became crazed with anger. A few days later, on November 7, 1938, he brought a gun into the German embassy in Paris and shot Ernst von Rath, a minor German official. The boy told police that he felt that wherever he went he was being chased like an animal. He said, "Being a Jew was not a crime. I am not a dog. I have a right to live, and the Jewish people have a right to exist on this earth." 2 days later, von Rath died. That night, on November 9, 1938, following the direction of Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, who blamed all the Jews for the shooting, Nazis and local citizens broke into hundreds of synagogues throughout Germany and Austria. They poured gasolines on the seats in the holy arks and set them on fire. Fire brigades came to protect the nearby buildings, but they did not extinguish the fires in the synagogues. Vandals broke the windows of thousands of Jewish-owned shops. In some cities, huge crowds of Germans and Austrians not involved in the attack stood by and watched. Jews were forced to watch too as their homes and belongings were destroyed. Many Jews distressed by what was happening committed suicide. Police kept onlookers from interfering with the vandals. They arrested Jews for their own protection, and the Jews could not defend themselves. Heinrich Himmler, the head of German police, issued an order that any Jew found with a weapon in his possession would be held in a concentration camp for a period of 20 years. That night in Leipzig, a boy was thrown from a third-story window. Both his legs were broken by the fall. In Fürth, Jews were dragged to a dark theater and forced to watch as their friends and families were beaten on stage. The exact number of Jews killed is not known. Early Nazi reports were that 36 Jews were killed, but the real number is surely much higher. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and taken to concentration camps. Hundreds of synagogues were destroyed. In Germany and Austria, streets where Jews lived and worked were littered with broken windows and debris. That terrible night became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Jews were ordered to repair any damage done to their shops and businesses, and insurance companies were ordered not to pay any Jewish claims for damage. Hermann Göring, chief of the German Air Force, was at a meeting just after Kristallnacht. He suggested that the Jews be forced to pay a fine of 1 billion German Reichsmarks to atone for the death of von Rath. He suggested was approved. Then he added, "I would like to say again, I would not like to be a Jew in Germany." Julius Rosenzweig lived in Frankfurt am Main. He remembers Kristallnacht. "I looked out of my window and saw the regular policemen in 2 brown shirts, the SA, come into our building. My mother told me to take a walk. If I didn't, I might have been arrested like so many others. A day or 2 later, I saw Jewish-owned department stores and all with broken windows. None of the stores reopened. They had no customers, no merchandise, no security. They were sold to Gentiles for almost nothing." Shulamit lived in Germany. She remembers the morning after Kristallnacht. "My uncle was the cantor in the great synagogue there. The next morning I came downstairs and he was sitting there with tears flowing down. 'What's the matter?' I asked. 'They burned my synagogue,' he said. He couldn't stop crying. Then the doorbell rang. It was the SS. 'Where is he? Where is he?' they asked. They took him away to Dachau." Rabbi Dr. Manfred remembers Kristallnacht. He was 9 years old on November 9, 1938. "Our parents were not at home. We 4 children, my 2 sisters, my brother and I, were home all alone when our uncle called us and said to turn off the lights, close the shutters, and give the impression that no one was home. We heard the sounds of furniture being thrown out of windows of the house of our next-door Jewish neighbors. Just at that time, we heard a key turn in our own door. The door opened, and it was Felix, the 17-year-old son of a Catholic family who lived upstairs. When he saw how terribly afraid we were, he told us, "Don't worry, I'm here now. I'm not like the rest of them." Immediately he changed into his Hitler Youth uniform, looked out a second-floor window, and shouted to the Nazi mob, "This house has been sold to Aryans. Any damage you will do, you will be responsible for. There are no more Jews here." The mob moved on, and so we were saved by this young man who proved with his heroic courage that he really was different from all the rest of them. Cantor Moshe remembers Kristallnacht in Vienna. We lived across from a school which was made into a prison. We heard terrible screams of people being beaten. People threw themselves out of windows. There were flames throughout the city. Another cantor also remembers that the destruction and the beatings didn't end after Kristallnacht. The fear was constant. We had the same fear a week later and a month later. Whatever wasn't destroyed then was destroyed later. Thea lived in Vienna. She remembers Kristallnacht. I belonged to a Zionist group. That night I was coming home from a meeting with a friend of mine. We saw flames coming out from buildings and uniformed Nazis breaking windows with rocks and axes. Some SA started to chase us. We ran into a building, closed and locked the door, and waited. When we were sure they would be gone, we came out. But they were still there. They chased us some more until they caught us. They let me go, but they sent my friend to Dachau. We heard from him once, but 2 weeks later. But never again. I assume he died at Dachau. Fred was arrested on Kristallnacht. He remembers, "They came to my store and told me to go to City Hall. When I got there, I saw every Jewish man from the village. It was a cold November night, but some of them were still in their pajamas. There was an American citizen, a tourist. He said, 'I'm an American citizen.' They said, 'You're a Jew,' and kicked him hard. The SS took us for a march of a couple of hours through the town, and the town residents looked at us as if we were criminals. They marched us to the next town and put us in a barn. The next morning, they marched us to the railway station. They loaded us into a freight train and took us to Dachau. When we got there, they opened the doors. 'Out!' they yelled at us and knocked us with the butts of their guns. I was in Dachau for 5 weeks. My mother brought a paper saying that I would leave Germany, so I was released. At that time, it was enough if you just left Germany." Rabbi Dr. Manfred's father was arrested in Frankfurt am Main on the day after Kristallnacht and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. He remembers, "My mother had finally gotten a visa for him and he was released after several weeks. He had lost 80 pounds. The Nazis had shaved off his entire beard. He had been severely beaten and he was covered all over with bloody wounds. When I saw him lying on the couch in our living room, I turned to my mother and asked her, 'Who is that man?' I just did not recognize him. 'It's your own father,' she answered me." Many people throughout the world were shocked and saddened by the events of Kristallnacht. There were protests and front-page stories in just about every American newspaper, as well as numerous editorials condemning Germany. The Nazis answered the protests with a warning that any actions against Germany would lead to more Jewish suffering. At a press conference a few days later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States said, "The news of the past few days from Germany has deeply shocked public opinion in the United States. Such news from any part of the world would inevitably produce a similar profound reaction among Americans in every part of the nation. I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in the 20th century civilization." In protest, the United States ambassador to Germany was told to return to Washington. In 1933, there were about 700,000 Jews living in Germany and Austria, but every year as Nazi policy became increasingly anti-Jewish, thousands of Jews left. The horrors of Kristallnacht made the need to escape even more urgent. Anita Federman lived in Liverpool, England. She remembers, "Sometime before World War II began, Helga, a Jewish girl my age, came from Germany to live with us. Her parents couldn't get out, but she did. There were lots of kids like her, and many of them had emotional problems. Imagine, they were torn from their families and were sent to a foreign-speaking country. The Jewish organization which brought her to us and looked after these children tried desperately to keep in touch with their families. But for the year Helga was with us, she never heard from her parents. It was a difficult time. For many Jews trying to leave Germany and Austria, there was no place to go. Guards of bordering countries turned them back. At the same press conference at which President Roosevelt decreed Kristallnacht, he was asked if any place had been found for the Jews who wished to leave Germany. He replied, "No, the time is not ripe for that." When he was asked if he would propose a loosening of immigration laws to allow more Jewish refugees to come to the United States, he said he would not. Jews in the United States held rallies, signed petitions, and sent letters to President Roosevelt, but polls conducted at the time that most Americans were against letting Jewish refugees into the United States, even refugee children, and the U.S. government refused to open its gates to the Jews. Arthur Friederman was a young boy living in the United States when the Nazis rose to power. He didn't hear too much about the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, only what his father read to him from the Yiddish newspapers at the dinner table. It all seemed so far away, until 1938. I went with my father to a rally at Madison Square Garden. There was a huge crowd. People who could not get into the garden were standing in the streets. There were speeches and loud reactions from the audience, calling for action. People were disillusioned with President Roosevelt because nothing was being done. I left that rally very anxious about the trouble in Germany. In July 1938, in France, delegates from 32 countries met to discuss the problem of Jewish refugees, but delegates complained of unemployment and overpopulation in the countries. Large, underpopulated countries with no unemployment problems didn't want Jews either. Some delegates said their countries could accept only agricultural workers, and Jews denied the right to own land for hundreds of years in Europe were not farmers. No place was found for the huge number of Jews desperate to escape Nazi persecution. Some Jews tried to escape to Switzerland. Although Switzerland bordered Germany and other countries, either allied with Germany or occupied by it, it remained neutral. Throughout the war, Clara Fieldman remembers, "As a young girl, I made it into Switzerland. I was pulled out of a creek by Swiss soldiers and brought to a military barracks. For 5 days and nights, I sat on dirty straw. I was interrogated by a Swiss officer. He told me, 'We're handing you over to the Germans. They know what to do with Jews.' But the Swiss didn't act on their threat. They didn't return her to Germany." Edith Ryan remembers, "The day after the Nazis marched into Austria, my father left. He had a German passport, so he was able to travel. But on the train with him were Jews with Austrian passports. They were not allowed to leave the country. My father told us often that he would never forget their cries and screams." Cantor Moshe was in Vienna. He remembers, "My father wanted to get out. No one would take us. Only one nearby country not under Hitler was Switzerland. My dad smuggled himself into Switzerland. They sent him back. Later he did get in. We got visas to come to America, but the American consul made my father return to Vienna to have his visa stamped. This was at the height of German atrocities, and they, the Americans, sent him back. The British controlled Palestine, and it was almost completely closed to Jews. Many of the Jews who escaped to Palestine by boat were considered by the British to be illegal immigrants and sent back to Europe. In 1939, a plan was proposed by a U.S. senator and a congresswoman to save 20,000 Jewish children under the age of 14 by bringing them into the United States. It was supported by former President Hoover and by Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, but not by the president. It was never passed through Congress. In 1939, the St. Louis, a ship with more than 900 Jewish refugees on board, was turned away by Cuba, even though all the passengers had landing certificate. As it began its trip back to Europe, the ship passed very close to the shores of Florida. The U.S. Coast Guard followed the ship. The Coast Guard had instructions from the government to make sure that not one refugee jumped off the St. Louis and swam ashore. On their return home to Europe, most of the refugees were led into Holland, Belgium, France, and England. These countries were still free. The refugees felt safe, but most of them would not survive the Holocaust. Within a year, Holland, Belgium, and France were conquered by the German army and subjected to Nazi rule. Other Jews tried to escape Nazi persecution by boat. Among the many who suffered were the 769 Romanian pastors on the SS Struma. It was a broken-down cattle boat headed for Palestine. The Jews boarded it in Romania on December 12, 1941. 4 days later, the boat broke down near the port of Istanbul, Turkey. The passengers were not allowed ashore. The British authorities refused to grant them permission to enter Palestine. The ship didn't move for more than 2 months. The passengers displayed a large sign, "Save us," but no one did. On February 23, 1942, the ship was tied to a tugboat and pulled into the Black Sea. In the middle of the sea, the SS Struma was unhooked from the tug. The next morning, it sank in the icy water. Only one passenger survived. 768 others, including 70 children, drowned. It was reported many years later that the broken-down cattle boat was sunk by a Soviet submarine.